Hi, so I'm making this video because I watched a lot of these videos before I started studying for my teas, and they were really helpful to me. So I just really wanted to pass it on. And if you have any questions, just comment down below and I'll do my best to answer them. So I took the teas in January of this year, and it was my first time taking it. And at that point, I had already finished taking all of my prerequisite classes, so anatomy, physiology, microbiology, chemistry. Those classes were all done. My overall score was 94%. My reading score was 83%. My math score was 100%. My science score was 97.9%. And my English score was 100%. I just used two books. So I used Metrics, looks like this. And I also used the official ATI TEAS manual. And I think both of these books have new editions out now, so they don't really look exactly like that anymore, but you get the idea. And I also used Khan Academy and my notes from my prerequisite classes as supplements. And I highly recommend buying the ATI practice tests because I thought those tests were extremely similar to the real test in terms of difficulty. Not the content, because there's like different content, but in terms of difficulty, they were basically identical. I scored on average 91 to 92% on the practice test, and on the real test, I scored 94%, which I think is really close. I think the tests are a really good way to basically get a feel of what the test will be like before you take it to lessen anxiety, and they're also a really good indicator of how you'll score on the test as well. They also let you know what learning objectives you missed on the practice test when you're done. So I thought that was really helpful in identifying your weaknesses. I would take into account how many practice tests you have first and then space them out accordingly. So for example, I had 6 tests, 3 from the Metrics book and 3 that I bought from ATI. And so I made sure to save one ATI test for the day right before my test. And then I spaced out the other tests 1 week apart before that test, if that makes sense. So basically, I just took one test each Saturday morning in the weeks before my test, like right before my test. And then the day right before my test, I also took that last test that I saved. And this made me feel really comfortable with the process of taking the test. And make sure you time yourself during the practice test as well. Just allow yourself as much time as they give you on the real test so that you give yourself the chance to get used to the timing of the test. And so now I'll break it down section by section. So for the reading section, I actually scored a lot lower on the real test than I did on the practice test. And I think it was mainly due to me being so stressed and tense. Like I was so stressed that my back was just in pain the whole time. And I think it affected my performance because on the practice test, I scored on average 95% on the reading section, but on the real test, I got 83%, which is a lot lower. And so my first piece of advice would be to read carefully but quickly. So carefully but quickly at the same time, because I made the mistake of reading each passage and question in like agonizing detail, like agonizing over every single word. And I ended up running out of time and having to rush through the last set of questions. And I was just reading it so carefully because I was so paranoid that I was going to miss something. So don't do that. Please don't do that. And so I started relaxing after that section and everything went well. I scored higher. So to study for this section, I just started off by skimming through both of the books that I had and just writing down anything that I felt like I didn't know or that I didn't really remember as well. And then the ATI manual also has practice questions, so just do those, and those are really good at helping you basically figure out what your weaknesses are. And by the end, you should have a list of specific topics that you're weak in. For example, my weaknesses included like broader things like drawing logical conclusions or using context to determine a word's meaning. And I would practice those a lot, like just search up practice questions. And then the list also had like more specific terms that you have to know, like almanac versus encyclopedia versus atlas, or table of contents versus index. Just make sure you know whatever that the ATI manual tells you to know, like all those terms. And just be really specific with your weaknesses for this section. Actually, for all the sections, but yeah. During my time studying for TEAS, I would just practice the broader things first, like here and there. I would search up, like I said, I would search up practice questions for example, like practice questions for determining the types of writing, and just practice until I was more comfortable with it, or like until I was completely comfortable with it. And for the more specific terms, like the almanac versus encyclopedia thing, I just saved those for the last few days before the test and then memorized them. For this section, you just need to keep identifying and practicing your weaknesses and practice reading quickly too. So for the math section, I got 100%, and I have to say, I think this section was the easiest section for me. I also got around the same score on the practice tests, and I finished this section with a lot of time to spare. And honestly, I think for this section, just go through the Mometrics math section really, really well and make sure you understand every single concept in there, like 100%, and you should be good. I just made sure that I was completely comfortable doing every single type of problem in Mometrics. Like, not just being comfortable doing the problems that are there, like, make sure you really understand the concepts behind those problems and make sure you know how to do those types of problems. I also did the same thing with the ATI TEAS manual math section, and that was helpful. I also did Brandon Craft's free math practice test for TEAS, and I perfected any concepts that I got wrong on there. And just like I did for reading, I also made a list of my specific weaknesses so that I could practice them. And my weaknesses included like volume and area formulas, as well as common conversions between the standard and metric systems. But those were more like memorizing things, so I just worked on those the week of the test, just so they would be fresher in my mind. The TEAS math section is much easier than SAT math in my opinion. It's very straightforward, and I was aiming for 100% in the section because I knew it was very doable. As long as you make sure that you are familiar with the concept, you should be good. So the science section was definitely the most stressful for me because I was so sure that I would never be able to study enough to get a good score in this section, but I ended up with a 97.9%, and I was really surprised because on the practice tests, I usually averaged around 89%, but I did spend most of my time studying for this section, and I finished this section with a lot of time to spare on the test because I feel like this section is more like if you know it, and it was really straightforward. To study for this section, I first did the same thing as the other sections where I went through the science section in the books and wrote down all of my weaknesses. So I just wrote down all of my weaknesses, but neither book had sufficient information for the section. Like, they're a good starting point, but they're not detailed enough. And make sure you pay attention to the learning objectives in the ATI manual, and also pay really close attention to things that they tell you to know on the pages for each learning objective. For example, one of the learning objectives pages said, you should have a general understanding of the pathologies of the circulatory system, such as heart attacks, strokes, aneurysms, etc. It might seem like a minor detail because they're just like specific terms, but if the manual tells you to know it, like be familiar with it, make sure you know it because it's probably going to be on the test. What the manual told me to know was usually on the test, even if they seemed like small details. So basically, that's all I did for the life and physical sciences part of it. I just wrote down my weaknesses and practiced it. I also relied on a combination of Khan Academy, notes from various classes like chemistry and micro, and just information that I searched up. But for anatomy and physiology, I had a more methodical approach. I basically went through all of the systems one by one. I dedicated a few days to learning each system in detail. You don't need to know the systems in crazy detail, but you do need to know more detail than just the basics that you find in a short review video. Like, basically, most of the things that you learn in class, like the key things that you learn in class, that's what you need to know. So here's what I did for each system. So step one was that I would watch videos. First, I would watch Bozeman Science, like his overview of the system, because like he goes over it kind of broadly, so I would watch that as a refresher. And then I would watch Science with Susanna. So Science with Susanna has a website, and I would go on there and watch basically every single video that she had on that section. It was a bit time consuming, but it was worth it for me. It refreshed my memory a lot, and it even taught me like new things that were on the test that I didn't even know before. Science with Susanna was lifesaver. It was by far the most helpful resource for me for this section, and I'm really grateful for her. If it helps, you can watch her videos on 2x speed like I did to save time. And another resource that was helpful was Dr. Moore's Anatomy and Physiology YouTube channel. That was a great channel. Step 2 was going through all of my notes from anatomy and physiology. I basically just pretended like I was lecturing on the system while I went through my notes. I would read them out loud and try to say all of the information in my own words without looking at the notes. Like, I would look at it sometimes to like remind myself of where I was in my lecture, but I would try not to look at it. Like, I would try to recall it from memory. And if there was any information that I didn't know as well, I would basically find myself having to look at the notes more, and that's how I knew that I was iffy on that whatever information that was, and then I would highlight it. And then after I finished my lecture, I would run through the highlighted parts again and again until I knew it well. And I just left the highlighted parts there because the day before the test, I also ran over the highlighted parts one more time. So step 3 was that I would just quickly skim over the systems, the information that the books had on the system. Like, I would just skim over it really quick once again. And then step 4 was that I would search up practice questions for the system and do like a lot of them. Like, I would just search up circulatory system practice questions, and I would just do like 100. No, I would do like 5, as many practice questions as I could find. And whatever I got wrong, I would try to like commit that to memory. And that's it. Those were my 4 steps. Besides that, what I did was, as I took the practice tests, I would just keep going over whatever learning objectives that I was missing on the practice tests. And also the day before the test, like my real test, after I took my last practice test, I looked at the results of all the practice tests I had taken to see if there were any learning objectives that I had missed on more than one test. So if there's like any patterns, and then I would go over those again in detail. So like, for example, if I missed the circulatory system on like 2 or 3 of the practice tests, I would go over the circulatory system again in detail. Like, I would focus on that because I know that that's like one of my biggest weaknesses. And the day before the test, I also watched as many Science with Susanna videos as possible, just whichever ones I felt were most relevant. But don't stress too much the day before the test because you need a lot of sleep. So the reading section, I also got 100%, and I was also really surprised at that because on the practice test, I think this was my worst section. I think on average, I scored around 84% on the practice tests for the English section. To me, the English section on the TEAS was harder than the SAT English section because on the SAT, it was more of like figuring it out, but on the TEAS, like, you actually have to know the rules. But studying for this section was really straightforward to me. It was more of just making sure that you understand the rules, and then you're basically good to go. I just went through the reading section in both books and made a list of weaknesses as usual. And it was really helpful to do the practice questions that you can find in the ATI manual and also in the ATI practice tests, because that's how I pinpointed exactly what I'm bad at. For me, I found defining prefixes and suffixes to be the hardest by far. And my advice for that specific topic is just not to overthink it, because every time I overthought questions like that, I just ended up getting them wrong. The answer was usually more obvious than I thought. And remember, for prefixes and suffixes, like when you're trying to define them, remember to use context clues because they're really important for those types of questions. For this section, just basically make sure you know all of the rules. For example, like know things like spelling rules, sentence structure, subject-verb agreement, pronoun antecedent agreement, and etc. I would also try to understand exactly what makes up an independent clause and dependent clause, because I didn't know we really needed to know that, but knowing that is helpful for like the questions where you need to identify what type of sentence it is. And that's basically it. That's all I can remember. But if you do have any specific questions, I'll do my best to try to answer them. So just comment them down below. Bye.